You're pregnant? The pen in Julian Mercer's hand snapped against the table with a sharp, sudden crack, ink bleeding across the paper beneath it. And that was the only sign anything in him had broken at all. His voice remained calm, controlled, almost indifferent, which made the words cut deeper than if he had raised it, because it meant he had already decided what this meant before Soren Blythe could even try to explain. Soren stood across from him, fingers tightening around the small notebook in his hands, the tremor in his wrist betraying him for just a second before he forced himself to nod. Once, steady, even as his grip tightened hard enough to crease the paper. The silence stretched, heavy, suffocating. Julian let out a slow breath and turned away, dragging a hand through his hair before bracing it against the edge of the table, his shoulders rigid, his jaw set. "Of course," he murmured, almost under his breath. "I should have expected this." Soren stepped forward quickly, writing the pen, pressing too hard, the first word coming out uneven before he forced himself to continue, crossing out a letter and correcting it before sliding the notebook across. But Julian didn't reach for it immediately, his gaze fixed on Soren instead, sharp, searching, not for truth, but for confirmation. "You planned this," he said, flat, certain, and when he finally looked down, it was only to fulfill the motion, not to consider the answer. "It wasn't planned," he read aloud, his tone empty, then a short, humorless breath escaped him as he pushed the notebook back harder than necessary, the paper skidding across the table. "You just found a way to make sure I can never leave," he added, quieter now, but far more cutting. And that was the moment Soren's fingers stilled completely, hovering over the page before slowly withdrawing, because there was nothing left that would be heard. Julian straightened, smoothing his sleeve as if resetting himself, his expression returning to that same distant control that had defined their entire marriage. "I won't deny the child," he said, his voice turning clinical, detached. "It's mine. I'll take responsibility." Soren's fingers curled faintly at his sides. "You'll have everything you need. Medical care, stability, pheromone support," Julian continued, precise, deliberate. "But don't misunderstand this." Now he looked directly at him, his eyes cold and unwavering. "This changes. Nothing between us." The silence pressed heavier. "I won't be manipulated into something I never agreed to, and I won't pretend this is anything more than what it is." Soren lowered his gaze and nodded once, because that was all he could do, all he had ever been allowed to do. And for the briefest second, something flickered in Julian's expression, something uncertain, almost soft, but it disappeared just as quickly, buried under something far more solid. "Good," he said, turning away, ending it. Their marriage had never been anything else, not really. It had been built on obligation from the start, on a debt Soren had never chosen, but had inherited all the same. His parents had died saving Julian's grandfather, and years later that sacrifice had been repaid in the only way the Mercer family understood, with control, with arrangement, with expectation. Soren had been brought into Julian's world and placed beside him like something owed, something unavoidable, and Julian had accepted it the way he accepted everything else, without warmth, without resistance, but without giving anything beyond what was required, because Julian already had someone else, someone he remembered, someone he believed had saved him, someone who had stayed by his side after the accident overseas that had fractured his memory, the person he loved, the person he owed, and Soren had never been part of that truth, no matter what anyone else claimed. So for over a year, they had lived like strangers, sharing the same space. Julian fulfilled his responsibilities. Soren stayed silent and out of his way, and neither of them crossed the invisible boundary between them. Until the night that boundary broke. It had started with a tension Julian couldn't suppress, something restless beneath his skin, his senses sharpening, his control thinning, something deeper rising before he could contain it. And by the time he recognized what it was already too late. Instinct had taken hold where reason could not reach. He had tried to isolate himself, to wait it out, to maintain the distance he had always kept, but then the scent reached him, soft, delicate, like white camellia carried on a faint breeze, subtle but unmistakable, and something inside him reacted instantly, tightening, pulling, the restraint he relied on fracturing in a way that felt both foreign and disturbingly familiar. It felt like something he had lost, And that was exactly what made it impossible to ignore. He didn't want to follow it, didn't want to acknowledge it, but his steps had already turned, drawn toward it before he could stop himself, before he could think. And when he found Soren standing quietly in that scent, unaware of what was happening, unaware of the effect he had, the world narrowed, everything else fading, the past, the promises, even the guilt, all drowned beneath something immediate, something overwhelming, something that felt dangerously close to recognition. For a moment, it didn't feel like losing control. It felt like returning to something he had forgotten. And afterward, when clarity returned and the weight of reality followed, Julian reached for the only explanation that didn't force him to question everything else. Soren had planned it. Soren had used the one moment he couldn't control to bind him tighter, to make sure he could never walk away. And that belief settled into place as something solid, something safe. Weeks later, in a sterile clinic room filled with the low hum of machines, Soren sat with the medical report in his hands, his eyes scanning the words again and again as if they might change. But they didn't. The diagnosis remained the same, cold, final, and the recommendation beneath it just as clear: treatment offered a chance, but only if he chose it now, only if he didn't continue the pregnancy. His fingers tightened, the edge of the paper bending under the pressure, his hand drifting unconsciously to rest over his stomach. And for a long moment, everything stilled, suspended, as if the world itself was waiting for his answer. When he finally closed his eyes, the decision had already been made, not because it was easy, but because it was the only one he could live with. And when he opened them again, there was no hesitation left, only a quiet, unshakable resolve. He folded the report carefully and slipped it back into the envelope, his expression calm, composed, as if nothing had changed at all, as if everything had. The next morning, the silence in the house felt colder, sharper, as if something from the night before had settled into the walls and refused to leave. And Soren Blythe moved through it carefully, one hand brushing lightly against the wall as he made his way downstairs, his steps slower than usual but controlled, his expression composed despite the faint strain beneath it. Julian Mercer was already seated at the table, posture straight, pen steady in his hand, as if nothing had changed, as if the night before had been nothing more than a disruption already corrected. And yet when Soren stepped into the room, that faint scent followed again, soft and delicate like white camellia, subtle but enough. And Julian's hand paused for just a fraction of a second before continuing. "You're late," Julian said. Without looking up, his tone even, Soren shook his head quickly, reaching for his notebook, writing slower than usual before sliding it across. Julian glanced down. "Doctor's appointment," he read, then set it aside without comment. "If it's related to the pregnancy, inform the house manager next time." Soren nodded, lowering his gaze, his fingers tightening briefly before relaxing again. There was a pause, and in that pause, the scent lingered once more, quiet but persistent, and something about it felt familiar in a way Julian could not place. "Avoid unnecessary movement," Julian added after a moment, his voice controlled. Soren looked up slightly, surprised, then nodded again. Julian didn't meet his eyes. Later that afternoon, the sound of the front door broke the stillness, footsteps following with an ease that did not belong to the house, and yet fit too easily within it. Julian looked up, and the shift in him was immediate. "Julian," Elliot Crane said as he stepped inside, his tone warm, effortless. Julian stood, the tension in his shoulders easing almost instantly. "You're back earlier than expected," he said, his voice lower now. Elliot smiled, stepping closer without hesitation. "I missed you," he replied lightly. From the staircase above, Soren had stopped mid-step, his hand resting against the railing as he watched, his gaze fixed on the way Julian's posture changed, the way his voice softened. The difference small but undeniable. Elliot's gaze flickered upward briefly, catching that stillness before Soren stepped back into shadow. That evening, the three of them shared the same space, the distance between them quiet but deliberate. Soren seated at the far end of the table, his presence almost blending into the silence while Elliot filled it easily, speaking with a familiarity that came naturally. And Julian responded in kind, his tone softer, his posture less rigid. But as the conversation continued, something unsettled surfaced, subtle but persistent. The scents in the room overlapped, similar enough to confuse but not identical. Elliot's clear, defined, exactly as Julian remembered, while Soren's was softer, quieter, and yet when it reached him, it brought with it a calm that didn't align with what he believed. Julian's grip tightened slightly around his glass. It didn't make sense. You're distracted, Elliot said, noticing immediately, his tone light, but his gaze sharp. Julian exhaled slowly, forcing the thought down. It's nothing, he replied, but the answer came a fraction too late. Elliot watched him for a moment longer, then shifted slightly closer, his presence steady, his sense stronger, deliberate. Across the table, Soren remained still, his head lowered, his hand resting lightly over his stomach, silent as ever. The conversation resumed as if nothing had happened, but something had, something small, something almost imperceptible, and yet enough. Because for the first time, the certainty Julian had always relied on did not feel entirely unshakable, and somewhere beneath the surface, a question had begun to form, quiet but persistent, one he refused to follow, even as it refused to disappear. Julian Mercer did not remember falling asleep. Only the weight of exhaustion settling somewhere between unfinished documents and a silence that had grown too heavy to ignore, his head resting back against the chair, fingers still loosely curled around a pen that had long since stopped moving. It was the scent that reached him first, soft and familiar, slipping through the haze of sleep, like something remembered rather than discovered, delicate, like white camellia carried on a faint breeze, lighter than he expected and yet far more grounding. And without thinking, his hand lifted, reaching, closing around something warm and real, pulling it closer as if it had always belonged there. The calm that followed was immediate, instinctive, the tension he carried so constantly dissolving into something quiet and steady, his breathing slowing as if his body had found what it had been searching for. For a moment, nothing else existed. Elliot, the name surfaced automatically, because it had always been Elliot, because it had to be, and yet something about it felt different, softer, quieter, but somehow more right. His eyes opened. It wasn't Elliot. Soren Blythe stood too close, caught in the space Julian had pulled him into, his body tense, his breath held, his eyes wide for just a second before dropping immediately. And Julian's grip loosened as if burned, his hand pulling back sharply. "What are you doing?" Julian's voice came out colder than he intended, the remnants of something unsettled buried beneath immediate defense. Soren shook his head quickly, his hands lifting for a moment before falling again. Unable to explain something he had not caused, Julian pushed himself upright, distance returning in an instant, his expression hardening as if the moment had never happened. "Don't cross the line," he said, each word precise and controlled. Soren lowered his gaze and stepped back immediately, creating the space Julian had already claimed. Neither of them noticed Elliot Crane standing at the doorway at first. He had already seen enough. "Am I interrupting something?" Elliot's tone was light, almost amused. Julian turned sharply, the tension in him redirecting at once. "No," he said quickly, too quickly. "It's nothing." Elliot's gaze flickered briefly toward Soren, then back to Julian, his smile unchanged, though something beneath it had sharpened. Soren moved first, slipping quietly past them as if he had never been there at all, and neither of them stopped him. The door closed softly behind him. For a moment, the room settled into silence. "You looked comfortable," Elliot said after a beat, his tone casual, but his eyes remained sharp. Julian's expression tightened slightly before settling again. "I was asleep," he replied, dismissive, final. Elliot hummed softly, as if accepting that, though his gaze did not waver. "Strange," he said quietly. "You've never reacted like that before." And that was enough to stir the unease in Julian again, brief but unmistakable, before he forced it back down. "You're overthinking," Julian said, colder now. Because certainty was easier than doubt. Elliot smiled and stepped closer, his shoulder brushing lightly against Julian's as if reclaiming something that had almost slipped. "Maybe," he said, though his thoughts ran elsewhere, because what he had seen hadn't been confusion or obligation. It had been instinct, and instinct did not lie as easily as memory could be rewritten. Later that evening, the quiet returned, but something had changed, subtle, almost invisible, and yet impossible to undo. Julian didn't look at Soren again, not directly, but he was aware of him in a way he hadn't been before, aware of the faint trace of white camellia, of the way his thoughts stalled for a second too long whenever it reached him. It didn't make sense, and yet it stayed. Across the room, Soren moved more carefully now, smaller somehow, as if he had learned something from that moment. While near the window, Elliot watched them both in silence, calm on the surface, though something beneath it had already begun to shift, because for the first time, doubt had entered a place that had once been absolute, and Elliot had seen it, and that was enough. By midday, the tension in the house had shifted into something sharper, less visible but more controlled, settling into every quiet movement and every glance that lingered a second too long. Soren Blythe moved carefully through it, a tray balanced in his hands, his steps steady despite the faint strain beneath them, his focus fixed on not making a mistake, because mistakes no longer stayed small. Across the room, Julian Mercer sat reviewing a file, his attention split in a way he refused to acknowledge, while Elliot Crane stood nearby, his posture relaxed, his presence easy, as if nothing in the room was out of place. The moment it happened was small, almost insignificant, the edge of the tray shifting just enough, a cup tilting, liquid spilling across the surface and over the side, the sharp sound breaking the silence. Julian looked up immediately, but it was Elliot he moved toward first. "Did it burn you?" he asked, already checking, his tone tight with concern. "It's nothing," Elliot replied softly, his expression calm, reassuring. Julian exhaled, the tension easing just enough before redirecting, his gaze turning colder as it settled on Soren. "Be more careful," he said flatly. Soren nodded quickly, lowering his head, his fingers tightening briefly around the edge of the tray before releasing it again. He didn't try to explain. He had learned that explanations didn't change outcomes. Elliot watched the exchange without interruption, his expression unreadable for a moment before softening again, the faintest shift of satisfaction passing unnoticed. Later, the house returned to quiet, but it no longer felt neutral, the air carrying something unsettled beneath the surface. Julian sat alone again, the file in front of him open but unread, his gaze fixed on a line that refused to settle into place. Something about it didn't align, a detail out of order, small enough to ignore but persistent enough to return. He frowned slightly, his fingers tapping once against the page before stilling. "You're still looking at that?" Elliot's voice came from behind him, light, familiar. Julian didn't turn immediately. "Some of the records don't match," he said. Elliot stepped closer, glancing down briefly before straightening again. "Old files can be inconsistent," he replied easily, "especially after everything you went through." The words were casual, almost dismissive, but placed carefully. Julian exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough for the thought to loosen. It was a reasonable explanation, simple, clean, easier than questioning further. He closed the file. Across the hall, Soren stood just out of sight, his hand resting lightly against the wall as he watched through the narrow space left by the door, his gaze fixed on the moment that had almost shifted something, almost changed the direction of everything. Almost. His fingers tightened slightly before falling still again. Inside the room, Elliot's expression settled back into something calm and controlled, the brief flicker of tension gone as quickly as it had appeared, because the uncertainty had been contained before it could take hold. And Julian, already turning away from the file, let the doubt go just as easily, not because it had been resolved, but because it was easier not to follow it, easier to return to what he believed he already knew, even as something beneath that certainty remained quietly unresolved. The shift came gradually, in moments small enough to dismiss on their own, but together they formed something unmistakable, something Soren Blythe could feel even if no one ever said it aloud. By the fifth day, Elliot Crane no longer felt like a guest in the house, his voice and presence settling too easily into spaces that had once belonged to silence, and Soren had learned to avoid those spaces when he could, though avoidance only went so far when the house itself had begun to feel smaller. That afternoon, Soren steadied himself against the kitchen counter as a dull ache sharpened beneath his ribs, his breath shallow as he waited for it to pass. He didn't hear Elliot until the voice came from behind him, soft, almost concerned. You should be more careful, Elliot said. Soren stiffened and stepped back instinctively, his balance faltering just enough for Elliot to catch his arm before he could steady himself. You look unwell, Elliot added, his gaze sharper than his tone. Soren shook his head at once and pulled away, his hand moving instinctively toward his abdomen. Elliot noticed. You should rest, he said lightly, stepping back as if nothing had happened. You wouldn't want to cause unnecessary concern. Later that evening, Elliot approached Julian Mercer in the sitting room, his tone casual, almost reluctant. I think you should speak to him, he said. Julian looked up. About what? Elliot hesitated just enough to make the answer seem unplanned. He hasn't been well, he said quietly. But he doesn't seem to want you to know. Concern surfaced first in Julian's expression, then sharpened into something colder. When he found Soren in the hall, his voice was controlled but edged. What happened earlier? Soren looked up, startled, reaching for his notebook, but Julian continued before he could write. Why didn't you say anything? Soren's hand paused, then moved again, the letters slightly uneven. It's nothing, Julian read aloud, and his expression hardened immediately. You don't get to decide that, he said. If there's a problem, you inform me. I won't have unnecessary complications because you chose to ignore something. Soren's fingers tightened around the notebook before lowering it again, his gaze dropping as he nodded once. The explanation stayed unfinished. It didn't matter. Julian watched him for a second longer, something unsettled flickering briefly before he pushed it aside. Rest, he said at last, softer but no less distant, then turned away. From the corner of the hall, Elliot observed the exchange in silence, his expression calm, almost detached, though beneath it something had already settled into certainty. Julian's doubt was real, and more importantly, it could be redirected. His gaze shifted briefly towards Soren, who remained where he was, smaller somehow, quieter, as if he had already begun to disappear from the spaces he once occupied, and Elliot's calm sharpened into quiet resolve. Because the easier Soren was to overlook, the easier it would be to erase him entirely. By the time the next week settled in, the distance inside the house had taken on a structure of its own, something predictable, something enforced, and Soren Blythe had already learned how to exist within it without resistance, without expectation, his movements quieter, his presence smaller, as if minimizing himself could lessen the weight pressing down on him. But the body did not obey the same rules as silence. And no matter how carefully he moved, how little space he took, the exhaustion continued to build, slow and relentless, layering itself over the weakness he could no longer hide, even from himself. That morning, it happened again. His vision blurred as he stood near the edge of the hallway, the light too sharp, the air too thin, and for a moment, the world tilted just enough to force him to reach out, his hand catching against the wall to steady himself. You're pale. Julian Mercer's voice came from behind him, low, controlled, but closer than expected, and Soren stiffened, turning slightly, his instinct immediate, to compose himself, to appear unaffected, his hand dropping from the wall as if it had never been there. Julian's gaze lingered on him for a second longer than usual, sharp, assessing, something unreadable flickering beneath the surface. Sit, he said after a moment, the word quiet but firm. Soren hesitated, then nodded once, lowering himself slowly into the nearest chair, his movements careful, measured. Julian didn't move immediately, his jaw tightening slightly as if weighing something. Then he stepped closer, the distance closing just enough for the faint trace of white camellia to reach him again. Softer now, weaker, but still unmistakable. Something in his chest shifted, unsteady, but he pushed it down before it could take shape. You've been careless, Julian said, his tone even, though the edge beneath it remained. If this continues, it becomes a problem. Soren's fingers tightened, faintly against his sleeve, but he nodded again, because explanation had long since lost its place between them. Julian exhaled slowly, then reached out, his hand stopping just short for a fraction of a second before continuing, resting briefly against Soren's wrist, controlled, deliberate, the contact clinical, measured. Pheromones, the obligation he had already accepted, nothing more, but the effect was immediate. The tension in Soren's body easing just slightly, his breathing stabilizing in. a way that felt almost unfamiliar now. Julian noticed. Of course he did. His gaze flickered, something unsettled surfacing again before being forced back into place. "This is for the child," he said, his voice quieter now, as if the clarification was necessary, as if it needed to be said aloud to remain true. Soren lowered his gaze and nodded, his hand curling faintly against his lap, because he understood what was being said, and more importantly, what wasn't. Later that afternoon, the walls of the house felt too close, too heavy, and for the first time in days, Soren stepped outside of them. The clinic was quiet, sterile, the air carrying that familiar scent of antiseptic and something faintly metallic, and for a moment, standing there felt easier than returning to the place he had just left. The nurse guided him through routine steps, questions asked, answers written instead of spoken, until the door to the consultation room opened, and the world shifted in a way Soren hadn't expected. "Soren?" The voice was hesitant, surprised, and when Soren looked up, something unfamiliar flickered across his expression, something that hadn't appeared in days. Recognition. The man standing in front of him froze for just a second, then stepped forward, his expression softening into something warmer, something real. "It's been a long time," he said quietly. Soren blinked once, then nodded slowly, his fingers tightening slightly around the notebook in his hands. "Dr. Daniel Reeves." The name came back in fragments, memories from years ago, from a time that felt distant now, simpler, before everything had shifted into something else. "You haven't changed much," Daniel added with a faint smile, though his eyes lingered, sharper now, taking in the details Soren hadn't realized were visible. The paleness, the way he held himself, the quiet strain beneath the surface. "Sit," Daniel said gently, gesturing toward the chair, his tone professional but no less warm. This time, the word didn't feel like an order. It felt like concern. Soren sat. The examination didn't take long, but the silence that followed stretched in a way that felt different from the silence he had grown used to. This one waiting, not dismissing. Daniel set the report down slowly, his expression no longer neutral. "You should have come sooner," he said, his voice low, controlled, but the concern beneath it unmistakable. Soren's fingers tightened slightly. Daniel watched him for a moment longer, then exhaled quietly, his tone softening. "You're dealing with too much at once," he continued, "and you're doing it alone." It wasn't a question. Soren lowered his gaze, his hand moving instinctively to rest over his stomach. Daniel followed the movement, his expression shifting again, something heavier settling beneath the surface. "Does he know?" he asked carefully. Soren shook his head immediately. "Does he care to know?" Daniel added, just as carefully, and this time, Soren didn't respond at all. The silence was answer enough. Daniel leaned back slightly, his gaze steady, thoughtful. Then something in it changed, subtle but decisive. "All right," he said quietly, as if coming to a conclusion of his own. "Then I will." Soren looked up, startled, confusion flickering briefly across his expression. Daniel shook his head faintly, correcting himself. "Not like that," he added, softer now. "But you're not going through this alone anymore." The words settled differently, not like obligation, not like duty, but something steadier, something Soren hadn't realized he needed until that moment. "I'll monitor your condition closely," Daniel continued, already shifting into something more structured, more certain, "and we'll adjust what we can, when we can." His gaze softened slightly. "And you'll come back regularly." Soren hesitated for just a second, then nodded, because this, at least, was something he could accept without question, something that didn't require him to defend, or explain, or endure. When he stepped back outside later, the air felt different, lighter in a way that didn't erase what was waiting for him, but made it easier to face. Back at the house, the silence remained, unchanged, but now, somewhere beyond it, something else existed too. And for the first time in a long while, Soren was not carrying everything entirely on his own. The breaking point did not come loudly. It arrived in a moment so ordinary it almost went unnoticed, the sound of glass against the floor sharper than it should have been, fragments scattering across the space between them as Soren Blythe stood frozen, his hand still half raised as if he could undo what had already happened. For a second, no one moved. Then Elliot Crane stepped back slightly, his expression shifting just enough to suggest pain, his hand brushing lightly against his wrist. Julian Mercer was already at his side. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice tight, controlled but immediate. "It's fine," Elliot replied quietly, though his brows drew together just enough to imply otherwise. Julian's gaze darkened as it shifted toward Soren. "What happened?" Soren shook his head quickly, reaching for his notebook, his movements unsteady as he tried to write. But Julian spoke again before he could finish. "You need to be more careful," he said, the disappointment in his tone sharper than anger. Soren's hand stilled, then lowered slowly. The explanation left incomplete, as always. The silence that followed pressed heavier than before, not because of what had happened, but because of what had already been decided. Julian turned back to Elliot, his focus returning entirely. "Let me see," he said, his tone softening again. Soren stepped back without being told, the space between them widening in a way that felt final, his presence reduced to something easy to overlook, easy to dismiss. Elliot didn't look at him again, not directly, but there was awareness there, quiet and certain, because this was no longer about a single mistake. It was about pattern, about perception, about how easily one version of events replaced another when no one chose to question it. Later that night, Soren stood in the dim hallway with a small bag in his hand, the decision already made long before this moment, long before any of this, his fingers tightening slightly around the strap before relaxing again. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to try, not when every attempt had already been turned away before it could take shape. He moved quietly toward the door, his steps steady despite the weight pressing against his chest, and when he reached it, he didn't hesitate. Behind him, the house remained unchanged, its silence intact, as if it had already adjusted to the absence he was about to leave behind. The door closed softly, and this time, Soren Blythe did not look back. The quiet was the first thing Soren Blythe noticed, but not the kind he had learned to endure, not the kind that pressed against his chest and made every breath feel heavier than the last. This quiet was different, softer, open in a way that did not demand anything from him. And for the first time in a long while, his body did not tense against it instinctively. The room was small. The light filtered through thin curtains instead of harsh glass, settling gently across the floor, and as Soren sat near the window, his shoulders lowered just slightly, a change so subtle he might not have noticed it himself. "You're sitting straighter today," Daniel Reeves said as he stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind him, his tone light, almost conversational, but his eyes sharp in the way of someone trained to notice what others overlooked. Soren glanced up, blinking once before giving a small nod, his fingers resting loosely in his lap, instead of gripping the edge of the chair as they had the days before. "That's good," Daniel continued, setting the file down before pulling a chair closer, not across from him, not distant, but angled just enough to avoid pressure. "It means your body is starting to trust that it doesn't need to fight all the time." The words were simple, but they settled differently, not as reassurance, but as something grounded, something real. Soren lowered his gaze slightly, his hand drifting instinctively toward his stomach, the motion smaller now, less tense. Daniel noticed, of course he did, but he didn't comment immediately, allowing the silence to remain something neutral rather than something that needed to be filled. "Any dizziness?" he asked after a moment. Soren nodded once. "Less than yesterday?" Another pause, another nod. Daniel exhaled softly, making a brief note. "Good. Then we're moving in the right direction," he said, and the word moving lingered in the air, unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. After the examination, Daniel didn't stand right away, didn't rush him out the way most would have. Instead, he leaned back slightly, resting his forearms loosely against his knees, his posture relaxed, unguarded in a way that made the space feel less clinical, less temporary. "You can stay a bit if you want," he said casually, glancing toward the window. "No one's waiting for the room." Soren hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded, the decision quiet, but meaningful. They didn't talk about anything heavy, not at first. Daniel spoke about small things, routine things, a new piece of equipment that had arrived late, a nurse who kept forgetting where she left her keys, details that carried no weight, no expectation, and for once, Soren listened without bracing himself for what might come next. You used to sit like this in the library, Daniel said at one point, his tone thoughtful rather than probing. Back in high school, he gestured lightly toward Soren's posture, quiet, still, like you were trying to disappear into the background. He paused, just briefly, then added, softer. I thought you just didn't want to talk. His gaze shifted, not directly meeting Soren's eyes, but close enough to acknowledge him. Now I think it was because no one was really listening. Soren's fingers tightened faintly against his sleeve, not in discomfort, but in recognition. Something small and unfamiliar loosening beneath the surface. Daniel didn't press further, didn't wait for an answer. He simply let the silence settle again. But this time it felt different, not empty, but shared. When Soren stood to leave, the movement slower than usual but steadier, Daniel reached for the door first, opening it without making a gesture of it, just enough to make the motion easier. Come back in 2 days, he said, his tone shifting back to something more structured. And if anything worsens, you don't wait. His voice lowered slightly, more firm now. You come in. Soren nodded, his grip tightening briefly around his notebook before relaxing again. And Soren, Daniel added, just before he stepped out, his tone softer now. You don't have to handle everything by yourself anymore. Soren paused, just for a second, then nodded once more, and this time, the movement felt less automatic. Outside, the air felt lighter, not because anything had changed, but because for the first time, he wasn't carrying all of it alone. Back at the Mercer estate, the absence had begun to settle into something tangible, not all at once, not in a way that demanded attention, but in small disruptions that refused to align with what Julian Mercer considered normal. It started with silence, the kind that lingered too long in places where it shouldn't have, the hallway too still, the space beside him too empty, and more than once, Julian found himself pausing without reason, as if something had been there before and no longer was. That faint trace of white camellia, subtle, nearly imperceptible, was gone, and the absence of it registered in a way he could not immediately explain. He noticed it when he stepped into a room and stopped for no reason, when his hand hovered briefly against the back of a chair before withdrawing, when something in his chest tightened and then settled again without resolution. He's not here, Julian said one evening, the words leaving him before he had decided whether they mattered. Elliot glanced up, his expression calm, measured. He left, he replied simply. Julian's gaze lingered, his jaw tightening slightly. Without saying anything, he asked, and there was something beneath the question this time, something less certain than before. Elliot shrugged lightly. Would it have made a difference? The answer came easily, too easily, and Julian didn't respond, because for the first time, the certainty he relied on did not come immediately. Later that night, he found himself standing in the doorway of a room he had never paid attention to before, his gaze scanning the emptiness, the absence more noticeable now than any presence had been, and for a brief moment, something unfamiliar surfaced, not regret, not yet, but something unsettled, something that did not fit. It didn't make sense why it felt different. It shouldn't have mattered, and yet, it did, just enough to remain. Across the city, Soren sat by the window of a small, quiet room, the lights softer, the air still, his hand resting lightly over his stomach as he watched the world move without needing to be part of it. And for the first time in a long while, the silence around him was not something he had to survive. It was something he could rest in, at least for now. Even if somewhere deep down, he understood that this quiet, this fragile sense of peace, would not last forever. The absence had stopped feeling temporary somewhere between the third and fourth day, though Julian Mercer did not mark the exact moment it changed, only that the house no longer adjusted around it, no longer filled the space it left behind, and instead allowed it to remain, quiet and persistent, settling into places he could not ignore. It showed in small things first, the way he paused at doorways without reason, the way his attention drifted mid-sentence during conversations that once required none, the way his hand lingered for a fraction too long on objects that held no meaning on their own. And beneath all of it, something else had begun to surface, something sharper, less familiar. You're distracted again, Elliot Crane said lightly from across the room, his tone easy, but his eyes observant. tracking every shift Julian did not acknowledge. Julian exhaled slowly, his gaze unfocused for just a second before returning. "It's nothing," he replied, though this time the words felt thinner, less definitive. Elliot watched him for a moment longer, then leaned back slightly, as if unconcerned. "If it's about him," he began, letting the implication linger just enough to provoke. Julian's expression tightened immediately. "It isn't," he said, more firmly than necessary, and Elliot smiled faintly, as if satisfied with the answer, even if he did not believe it. Later that afternoon, Julian found himself standing outside a place he had not planned to visit, the decision forming without clear intention, driven by something he had not fully acknowledged. The clinic was quieter than he expected, the air carrying that same sterile clarity, but something about it felt different from the spaces he was used to, less rigid, less controlled. He stepped inside without announcing himself. The receptionist barely had time to respond before his attention shifted past her, drawn toward the partially open door at the end of the hall. Voices carried through, low, calm. "You need to rest more," Daniel Reeves said, his tone steady but not forceful, the kind that did not demand compliance but made it easier to accept. "You're already pushing past what your body can handle." There was no judgment in the words, only concern grounded in observation. Julian's hand tightened slightly at his side. Through the narrow opening, he could see enough. Soren sat near the window, his posture smaller than Julian remembered, his shoulders slightly curved inward, his hand resting instinctively over his abdomen, the movement protective, unconscious. And Daniel stood close, but not too close, adjusting the position of the chair slightly, placing a glass of water within easy reach, his actions quiet, deliberate, practiced in a way that suggested familiarity. Something in Julian's chest tightened, sharp and unexpected. "You don't have to pretend you're fine here," Daniel added, softer now, and Soren's gaze lowered slightly, his fingers tightening faintly against the fabric of his sleeve. Julian stepped back before he could be seen, the movement immediate, instinctive, as if the space itself had become something he was not meant to occupy. The feeling that followed was unfamiliar, unwelcome. Irritation came first, quick, sharp, easier to hold on to than anything else. Then something beneath it, something less defined, something closer to unease. When Soren left the clinic later, Julian was already waiting outside, his posture controlled, his expression unreadable, as if he had always intended to be there. Soren stopped the moment he saw him, the brief stillness in his movement enough to confirm recognition, but nothing more. No surprise, no reaction beyond that. Julian's gaze moved over him quickly, assessing, noting what he had not noticed before, the paleness, the slower movements, the faint hesitation in each step, the way Soren held himself as if conserving what little strength remained. Something shifted again, sharper. This time, "You've been coming here," Julian said, his tone even, but there was something beneath it, something less neutral. Soren nodded once. "Why wasn't I informed?" Julian continued, and the question came out more controlled than it felt. Soren hesitated, then reached for his notebook, his movements slower than before, the pen pausing briefly before he began to write. Julian didn't wait. "Is it because of him?" he added, the words sharper now, the edge unmistakable, and for the first time, the emotion surfaced clearly, not concern, not fully, but something closer to possessiveness, something he had not allowed himself to recognize until now. Soren's hand stilled. The question hung between them, heavy, misplaced, but revealing. He shook his head immediately, his fingers tightening around the pen before continuing to write. Julian watched, but this time, he waited. The silence stretched. Soren turned the notebook toward him. "Medical." It read simply. Julian's gaze lingered on the word, then shifted back to Soren, sharper now, searching. "What kind of medical?" he asked, and the question carried more weight than before, more intent. Soren hesitated again, longer this time, then shook his head once, firmly, his hand lowering. The refusal was quiet, but clear. Julian's jaw tightened. The irritation returned first, instinctive, but it didn't settle as easily this time, because something else remained beneath it, something he could not dismiss. He stepped closer without thinking, his hand lifting, stopping just short before resting lightly against Soren's wrist. The contact controlled, familiar, the same justification as before. Obligation, pheromones. But this time, it was not as detached as he intended it to be. Soren's breath steadied slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to be noticeable. But his gaze remained lowered, guarded. Julian noticed that too. "You're weaker," he said, more quietly now. The observation no longer edged with accusation, but something closer to concern, though he did not name it as such. Soren didn't respond. He didn't deny it either. The silence stretched again. Julian's grip tightened slightly before releasing, his hand falling back to his side as if the contact had lasted longer than intended. "If there's a condition," Julian said after a moment, his tone controlled again, but less certain than before, "it needs to be addressed properly." Soren shook his head once more, the movement small but firm, his fingers curling faintly against his sleeve. Julian's gaze hardened slightly at the refusal. But this time, he did not push further, because for the first time, the resistance did not feel like defiance. It felt like distance, and that was something he did not know how to confront. Behind them, through the glass doors, Daniel watched quietly, his expression unreadable, but his posture still, attentive in a way that suggested he had seen enough to understand more than what had been said. And for the first time, something in Julian registered that presence not as neutral, but as interference. The unease sharpened again, clearer now, edged with something unfamiliar, something that felt dangerously close to jealousy. Soren stepped back then, creating distance once more, the movement slow but deliberate, his gaze lowering as he turned slightly, signaling the end of the conversation without words. Julian did not stop him, not this time. But as Soren walked away, his steps measured, careful, something in Julian remained. Unsettled, unresolved, the fragments of what he had seen, what he had noticed, refusing to align into something simple. The paleness, the weakness, the guarded silence, the way Soren had not denied anything, only refused to explain. It didn't fit. And for the first time, the question did not disappear when he tried to push it aside. It stayed, and somewhere beneath it, quieter but no less persistent, was the realization he had not yet fully faced, that whatever was happening to Soren Blythe, it had already gone further than he had allowed himself to notice, and by the time he began to understand it, he might already be too late. Julian Mercer did not return to the clinic the next day, nor the day after, but the thought of it did not leave him either. It lingered, persistent, surfacing at inconvenient moments, threading itself through his focus until even the smallest tasks felt slightly misaligned. It was not concern, not in the way he would have defined it. It was something less precise, something that unsettled rather than clarified. And the more he ignored it, the more it remained. By the third day, he stopped, pretending it would pass. The file sat open on his desk, its contents familiar and yet increasingly insufficient. Names, dates, fragments of records that should have been complete, but weren't, not entirely. His gaze lingered on a section that had been overlooked before, not because it was hidden, but because he had not thought to question it. Now he did. "Have someone pull the original reports," Julian said, his voice low, controlled, the instruction directed toward the assistant standing across from him. "All of them, not summaries." The assistant hesitated briefly, then nodded and left without question. The room fell silent again. But this time, the silence did not settle. It pressed. Across the city, Soren Blythe sat in the same chair by the window, the light softer than it had been days before, or perhaps it only felt that way now. His posture still careful, still conserving, but no longer as rigid, no longer braced against something unseen. Daniel Reeves stepped inside without knocking this time, not out of carelessness, but familiarity, setting a small paper bag on the table beside him. "You didn't eat enough yesterday," he said simply, his tone neutral, not questioning, just stating what he had already observed. Soren glanced at the bag, then at Daniel, a faint hesitation passing through his expression before he reached out, opening it slowly. Inside was something simple, easy to digest, nothing overwhelming. "You don't have to finish it," Daniel added, leaning lightly against the edge of the table. "Just enough Soren nodded once, his fingers tightening briefly around the edge of the bag before relaxing. Daniel watched for a moment, then looked away, giving him space rather than attention, a small gesture, but intentional. Your condition hasn't stabilized, Daniel said after a moment, quieter now, more direct. And stress isn't helping. He paused, then added, more carefully. Whatever environment you were in before, it wasn't sustainable. Soren's hand stilled for just a second, then continued, the motion slower. Daniel didn't press further. He didn't need to. Later that afternoon, the distance between intention and action finally closed. Julian stepped into the clinic again, this time not hesitating at the entrance, not pausing to reconsider. His expression set, his posture controlled, but the tension beneath it more visible now, less contained. The receptionist looked up, startled, but he didn't stop long enough for conversation, his gaze already scanning the space, searching. Mr. Mercer. Daniel's voice came from behind him, calm, measured, and when Julian turned, there was no surprise in Daniel's expression, only recognition. We need to talk, Julian said immediately, the formality in his tone deliberate, but the urgency beneath it harder to conceal. Daniel studied him for a second, then nodded once, gesturing toward the office. The door closed behind them. This isn't about you, Julian began, his voice low, controlled. But you've been treating him. Daniel didn't respond immediately, his posture relaxed, but his gaze steady. I don't disclose patient information, he said simply. Julian's jaw tightened slightly. The response expected, but unwelcome. Then answer this, Julian continued, stepping closer, the distance closing just enough to sharpen the space between them. Is there something I should know? The question landed heavier than intended, carrying more than just curiosity. Daniel's expression didn't change, but something in his gaze sharpened slightly, more focused now. If he wanted you to know, Daniel replied, just as evenly. You would. The answer was not dismissive, but it was final. Julian exhaled slowly, the frustration surfacing more clearly now, no longer as controlled as before. He's weaker, Julian said, more directly this time. He's been hiding something. Daniel held his gaze for a moment longer, then leaned back slightly, not retreating, but shifting the balance. Then maybe the question isn't what he's hiding, Daniel said quietly, but why he feels the need to. The words settled differently, not confrontational, but precise. Julian didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched, and for the first time, the direction of his thoughts shifted, not outward, but inward. Why? The answer did not come easily. When he stepped out of the office, the tension had not eased, but it had changed, less sharp, more complex, something that did not resolve into a single conclusion. Down the hall, he caught sight of Soren again, seated near the window, his posture smaller, his movements slower, but steady in a way that suggested he had adapted to something rather than overcome it. Julian stopped. Soren looked up, their gazes meeting for a brief moment, and something unspoken passed between them. Not understanding, not forgiveness, but recognition of distance, of everything that had not been said. Julian took a step forward, then stopped again, the words forming but not settling. This time, he did not ask a question. He did not demand an answer. Instead, his gaze lingered, longer than before, taking in details he had overlooked, the faint shadows beneath Soren's eyes, the way his hand rested protectively over his stomach, the subtle tension that remained even in stillness. It was not enough to understand. Not yet. But it was enough to change something. Because for the first time, Julian did not look at Soren and see a problem to control or a situation to manage. He saw something else, something he had not allowed himself to see before, and once seen, it did not disappear when he turned away. The tension did not break gradually. It arrived all at once, sharp and unannounced, carried through the heavy echo of a cane striking the marble floor, the sound precise, controlled, and unmistakable. Julian Mercer looked up immediately, his posture straightening instinctively before the figure even stepped fully into the room, the weight of authority preceding him as much as his presence did. Grandfather, Julian said, his tone measured, but something beneath it tightened, something that had not been there before. The old man did not respond at first, his gaze sweeping across the room slowly, deliberately, taking in everything. Julian. Elliot craned, standing just slightly behind him, composed as always, and the space itself, too quiet, too carefully arranged. You've made quite a mess of things, the old man said finally, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that did not need volume to assert itself. Julian's jaw tightened faintly. If this is about, he began, but the old man lifted his hand slightly, cutting him off without effort. I am not asking you to explain, he said, his gaze shifting, landing briefly on Elliot, sharp, assessing, lingering just long enough to make the silence uncomfortable. Elliot held the look, his expression polite, composed, but something beneath it shifted, subtle, calculating. So this is the one you've been protecting, the old man continued, his tone unchanged, but the implication clear, and for the first time, Elliot's smile faltered, just slightly at the edges. Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding, Elliot said smoothly, stepping forward just enough to close the distance, his voice respectful, controlled. I've never intended to cause any trouble here. The words were perfect, practiced, but the old man did not respond to them, did not acknowledge them at all. Instead, his gaze returned to Julian. You believe him? He asked simply. The question was direct, leaving no room for deflection. Julian hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, and in that pause, something shifted. He has no reason to lie, Julian replied, though the certainty in his voice no longer held the same weight it once did. The old man studied him for a moment longer, then exhaled quietly, not in frustration, but in something closer to disappointment. No reason, he repeated, slower this time. Then tell me, his gaze sharpened. What reason would that boy have? The question landed harder, heavier, because it did not name Soren, did not need to. Julian's expression tightened, his answer slower now, less immediate. That's not the point, he said finally, though even as he said it, the words felt insufficient. The old man's cane struck the floor again, once, deliberate. That is exactly the point, he said, his voice still calm, but no longer soft. You are choosing to believe in something that does not require proof, while dismissing something that stands right in front of you. The silence that followed stretched, heavy, unavoidable. Julian did not respond, for the first time. He did not have a response that settled cleanly. The old man's gaze shifted again, returning to Elliot, and this time, there was no patience left in it. You will leave, he said, the words simple, final, leaving no space for negotiation. Elliot blinked once, the composure slipping for just a fraction of a second before returning. Sir, with all due respect, you will leave, the old man repeated, the tone unchanged, but the weight behind it absolute, and something in the room shifted, something that made it clear the decision had already been made. Elliot's gaze flickered, briefly to Julian, searching, calculating, but Julian did not meet it. His attention caught somewhere else, somewhere unsettled. The pause stretched, then Elliot exhaled softly, his posture relaxing as if conceding, though the tension beneath it remained. Of course, he said, his voice smooth again, controlled. If that is what you want. But his eyes lingered just a fraction longer than necessary before he turned away. The calm too precise to be natural, the sound of the door closing behind him was quiet, but final. The room did not feel lighter. It felt exposed. The old man turned back to Julian, his expression unreadable, but his gaze sharp. You will bring him back, he said. Julian's head lifted slightly, the words landing differently this time. That is not necessary, he replied, though the response came slower than it should have. It is, the old man said, cutting him off again. You have a responsibility. His gaze held steady, unyielding. Not because I say so, but because you already know it. Julian's jaw tightened, the resistance rising instinctively, but it did not hold as firmly as before. The image of Soren surfaced uninvited, pale, unsteady, silent. He chose to leave, Julian said instead, but the argument lacked force. The old man's expression did not change, and you chose to let him, he replied, and that was the moment something shifted, something small, but irreversible. The silence stretched between them, heavier now, filled with everything that had not been said. Julian looked away first, for the first time, The certainty he had relied on felt incomplete, fractured at the edges. "Bring him back," the old man said again, quieter this time, but no less final. And this time, Julian did not argue, because somewhere beneath the doubt, beneath the resistance, beneath everything he had refused to acknowledge, there was something else, something that had been there longer than he had allowed himself to see. And now that it had surfaced, it did not disappear when he tried to push it aside. For the first time since Soren Blythe had left, Julian Mercer did not wait for the absence to settle on its own. He moved, not impulsively, not without thought, but with a quiet urgency that had been building beneath the surface for days, something that no longer allowed him to remain still. The clinic was the first place he returned to, not because he was certain Soren would be there, but because it was the only place that had felt real, unfiltered, untouched by the version of events he had accepted for too long. The door opened with a soft chime, and this time, he did not hesitate at the threshold. Daniel Reeves looked up from behind the counter, his expression unchanged, calm, but his gaze sharpened slightly the moment he recognized him. "You're back," Daniel said, not as a question. Julian didn't waste time. "Where is he?" The words came direct, stripped of the formality he usually maintained. Daniel held his gaze for a moment, long enough to measure intent, then exhaled. Quietly, "He's not here," he replied. Something in Julian's chest tightened, sharper than expected. "When was the last time he came in?" he asked. "Yesterday," Daniel answered, his tone steady. "He left early." A pause, just enough to make the next words land with more weight. "He didn't look well." Julian's jaw tightened slightly, the image immediate, uninvited, pale, unsteady, silent. "Where did he go?" Julian pressed. Daniel shook his head once. "I don't track my patients outside this place," he said, then added, quieter, but more pointed. "But if you're looking for him now, you're already late." The words hit harder than anything before, not loud, not harsh, but precise in a way that left no room for deflection. Julian didn't respond, because for the first time, he had nothing immediate to counter it with. He turned before the silence could settle, leaving the clinic with a pace that was no longer measured, no longer controlled. Back in the car, the city felt larger than it had before, distances longer, spaces harder to cross, and for the first time, uncertainty was not something he could dismiss. It followed him, persistent, threading through every thought until even the smallest delay felt like a mistake. Across the city, Soren sat in a quieter place, smaller than the house he had left behind, but steadier, the air lighter, the silence no longer something that pressed against him. The room was simple, the furniture minimal, but it was enough, more than enough. His hand rested lightly over his stomach, the motion instinctive, protective, his breathing slow, controlled, though the weakness had not lessened, not entirely. The knock at the door was soft, measured. Soren looked up. Daniel stepped inside, a small bag in his hand again, his expression calm, but his eyes sharper this time, more observant. "You didn't come in today," he said simply, setting the bag down. Soren hesitated, then shook his head once. Daniel studied him for a second longer, then nodded slightly, accepting the answer without pressing further. "You need to eat," he added, quieter now, placing the bag within reach. "Even if it's just a little." Soren nodded, slower this time. Daniel lingered for a moment, then glanced toward the window, his posture relaxed, but his tone shifting just slightly. "Someone came looking for you," he said, not casually, but not heavily either. Soren's hand stilled. "Julian," Daniel added, and the name settled into the room, heavier than expected. Soren's fingers tightened faintly, then loosened, his gaze lowering. He didn't respond. Daniel watched him for a moment, then spoke again, more carefully this time. "He seemed different," he said, choosing the word deliberately, not certain. Soren's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, almost imperceptibly. "You don't have to see him," Daniel continued, his voice steady, grounded. "Not unless you want to." The words were simple, but they carried weight, something Soren had not been given before. Soren nodded once, slower now, more deliberate. The decision settled quietly, without force. Later that evening, the shift began somewhere else entirely. Elliot Crane stood in the dim light of a room that no longer belonged to him. His expression calm, composed, but the stillness in it too precise, too controlled. His phone rested in his hand, the screen dark for a moment before lighting up again. A message sent, then another. The comm cracked, just slightly, not outwardly, but beneath the surface. Julian was moving. That much was clear now, and movement meant risk. Elliot's gaze hardened, the faintest edge appearing where there had been none before. If the narrative began to break, if doubt took hold fully, then everything he had built would unravel with it. He exhaled slowly, the decision forming not as hesitation, but as inevitability. If subtlety no longer held, then something stronger would be required, something that would leave no room for doubt, no room for choice. Across the city, Julian drove without a clear destination, the map on the screen shifting, recalculating, paths appearing and disappearing as quickly as his thoughts, each one leading nowhere certain. Frustration built, sharper now, edged with something unfamiliar, something closer to urgency than control. The memory of Soren's silence, his refusal to explain, the way he had stepped back, all of it replayed in fragments that refused to settle. It didn't make sense. None of it did. And yet, for the first time, he did not dismiss it. He followed it. And somewhere ahead, unseen but already in motion, something else had begun to take shape, something far less subtle, far more dangerous, because Elliot Crane was no longer trying to maintain control. He was preparing to force it. The shift from intention to action did not come with noise. It came with precision, quiet decisions made in places no one thought to look, and by the time it surfaced, it was already too late to stop. Soren Blythe did not notice it at first, the way the air felt slightly different when he stepped outside. That afternoon, the street quieter than usual, the movement of people just a fraction more distant, but something in him registered it, faint and instinctive, the same way his body had learned to recognize danger long before his mind could explain it. He paused for half a second near the curb, his fingers tightening slightly around the strap of his bag, then continued, because stopping had never changed anything before. Across the city, Julian Mercer's frustration had begun to sharpen into something else, something closer to urgency than control. His calls unanswered, his searches leading nowhere concrete, each lead dissolving before it could become something real. Check again. Julian said into the phone, his voice lower now, less controlled than usual. Every clinic, every record, I don't care how minor it looks. He ended the call before a response came, his hand tightening briefly around the device before dropping it back onto the seat beside him. He was running out of time, though he didn't yet know why. In another part of the city, Elliot Crane stood in the shadow of a building, his expression calm, composed, but the stillness in it too deliberate, too exact, as if every movement had already been calculated long before it happened. He's on his way. A voice said quietly through the phone. Elliot's gaze shifted slightly, his lips curving into something that resembled a smile, though there was no warmth in it. Good, he replied, his tone light, almost conversational. Make sure everything is ready. He ended the call without waiting for confirmation, his eyes lifting toward the street ahead, where the pieces were already beginning to fall into place. It happened quickly after that, too quickly for Soren to react in the way he might have once been able to, his steps slowing just slightly as the dizziness returned without warning, sharper than before, his vision blurring at the edges, the world tilting just enough to throw his balance off. He reached out instinctively, his hand brushing against the side of a parked car, but the support wasn't enough this time. The moment stretched, disjointed, fragmented, the sound of something approaching, the shift in the air, the presence that should not have been there. And then it closed in. There was no struggle, not in the way it might have been expected, only a brief resistance, a moment where Soren's body tried to hold its ground before giving way under the weight of something far stronger, far more deliberate. The world narrowed, the edges fading. The last thing he registered was the absence of space, of air, of distance, and then nothing. When Julian's phone rang, the sound cut through the silence of the car sharply, immediate, the number unfamiliar, unregistered. He answered without hesitation. Julian Mercer. His voice came out controlled, but there was an edge beneath it now, something closer to anticipation than calm. The voice on the other end was distorted slightly, but clear enough. "If you want to find him," it said, "you'll come alone." Julian's grip tightened instantly, the shift immediate, unmistakable. "Where?" he demanded. The line went silent for just a second, just long enough to make the next words land harder. "You'll be told," the voice replied, and then the call ended. The silence that followed was different from before, no longer empty, but charged, filled with something that did not allow hesitation. Julian did not wait. The engine started again almost immediately, the car moving before the thought had fully formed. Somewhere ahead, something had already begun, something he could no longer afford to misunderstand. And in a place far removed from where he stood, in a space where light barely reached and time felt suspended, Soren lay still, the quiet around him heavier than before. No longer gentle, no longer safe. And somewhere nearby, unseen but no longer hidden, Elliot Crane watched as everything unfolded exactly as he had planned. The final pieces moving into place with a precision that left no room for error, because this time, there would be no chance for the truth to surface before he decided how it would end. The location was exactly where the second call had directed him, abandoned, distant from anything that could interfere, the kind of place chosen not for convenience, but for control. Julian Mercer stepped out of the car before the engine had fully stopped, the door left open behind him, his movements no longer measured, no longer restrained, urgency overriding the precision he had relied on for years. The air felt heavier here, still, carrying something sharp beneath it, something wrong. "You're late." Elliot Crane's voice carried from somewhere ahead, calm, almost conversational, as if they were meeting under ordinary circumstances rather than this. Julian's gaze snapped forward, locking onto the figure standing in the dim space, composed, untouched, exactly as he had always been, and for a brief moment, something in Julian stilled, not calm, but focused. "Where is he?" Julian's voice cut through the space, lower now, stripped of everything unnecessary. Elliot tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question, then stepped aside just enough. "Right there," he said. Julian's gaze followed the motion, and everything else fell away. Soren Blythe was on the ground, his posture uneven, his body held upright only by the restraints that kept him from collapsing completely, his head lowered, his breathing shallow, uneven in a way that made something in Julian's chest tighten instantly. For a fraction of a second, nothing else existed. Then Elliot moved again, just enough to shift the frame. "And here," he added lightly, another figure, closer, partially obscured until that moment. Elliot himself stepping back into position, placing himself deliberately within the same line of sight, the implication forming before the words did. Julian's jaw tightened. Something was wrong, more wrong than before. "What is this?" Julian asked, his voice colder now, edged with something sharper. Elliot smiled faintly, the expression controlled, practiced, but no longer entirely convincing. "A correction," he said simply. The word lingered, unsettling in its simplicity. "You've been confused for a while now," Elliot continued, his tone softening, almost patient. "And I thought it would be easier if you could see things clearly again." Julian's gaze didn't leave Soren, didn't move, but something in his posture shifted, tension coiling tighter beneath the surface. "Untie him," Julian said, each word precise, controlled. Elliot didn't move. "You can," he replied, just as evenly, "but not yet." The pause that followed stretched, heavy. "There's something you need to do first." Julian's attention snapped back, his gaze sharpening, something darker surfacing now. "I'm not playing your games," he said. Elliot's smile didn't fade, but it changed, subtle, colder. "You already are," he said quietly. The silence that followed was different from anything before it, not empty, but loaded, pressing in from all sides. "You only get one," Elliot said finally. The words landed slowly, deliberately. "One?" Julian repeated, his voice lower now, dangerous in a way it had not been before. Elliot nodded slightly, his gaze steady, unwavering. "You take one of us with you," he said, as if explaining something simple, something obvious, and the other stays. The meaning settled, unmistakable. For the first time, Julian didn't respond immediately. The space between them shifted, something breaking open beneath the surface. That's not a choice, Julian said after a moment, his voice quieter now, but no less sharp. Elliot's expression didn't change. It is, he replied. Because you don't have time for anything else. Julian's gaze flickered, just for a second, back to Soren, taking in the details he had not allowed himself to fully see. Before, the pallor of his skin, the way his breathing faltered, the unnatural stillness between each shallow inhale, the hand that rested weakly against his own body as if even that small movement required effort. Something in Julian's chest tightened further, sharper now, closer to something he could not name. You're wasting time, Elliot added, softer this time, almost urging. Choose. The word landed heavier than anything before it. The moment stretched. Julian's thoughts did not settle. They fractured, splitting between what he knew, what he believed, what he had been told, and what he was seeing now, directly in front of him. Julian. Elliot's voice came again, quieter, closer, familiar in a way that had once grounded him. You know me, he said, and for a second, that familiarity held. Then something shifted, a scent, faint, almost lost beneath everything else, something softer, something weaker, but unmistakable, threading through the air in a way that did not belong to Elliot. Julian's breath caught. His gaze snapped back to Soren, sharper now, more focused, as if something had aligned just slightly out of place. The scent was wrong. No, not wrong. Misplaced. The realization came slowly, but once it surfaced, it did not recede. Julian. Elliot pressed, the edge in his voice sharpening now, no longer patient. We don't have time for this. The pressure built, tightening around the moment. Julian stepped forward, just one step, but it shifted everything. His gaze didn't leave Soren. Move, he said, his voice lower now, no longer directed at Elliot as a request. Elliot didn't. Choose, he repeated, sharper this time. The word hit differently now, no longer abstract, no longer distant. Julian's jaw tightened, his focus narrowing, the noise falling away until only what mattered remained. For a fraction of a second, the world stilled. Then he moved, not towards Soren. The decision came fast, instinctive in a way that felt familiar. Something shaped by memory rather than understanding. He closed the distance to Elliot first, pulling him free with a sharp motion, the movement decisive, immediate. Go, Julian said, his voice tight, controlled, already turning away. Elliot stumbled slightly, the shift unexpected, his expression flickering, just for a moment, before smoothing again. But something in his eyes had changed, something unsettled. Julian didn't look back. He was already moving, already turning, already heading towards Soren. The distance felt longer now, heavier, each step pulling against something that had not been there before. As he reached him, something shifted again. The air changed, the light flickered. The sharp, unmistakable scent of smoke cut through everything else. Julian froze for half a second, and in that half second, something broke. The present fractured. The same scent, sharper, stronger, years ago, heat, light, the sound of something collapsing, a hand reaching, pulling him back. From something he could not see, a voice he could not hear, a presence he had never been able to place. White camellia. Not strong, not overwhelming, but there, steady, grounding, the same as now. Julian's breath caught sharply, his vision blurred, not from the smoke, but from something else, something forcing its way through, past everything he had built to hold it back. Memory, not complete, not clear, but enough to know, enough to feel the weight of something he had lost, something he had misunderstood, something he had chosen against. His hand tightened around the restraint without realizing it. Behind him, Elliot's voice cut through again, sharper now, less controlled. Julian. But it no longer held the same weight. Julian didn't respond, because for the first time, the certainty he had held onto was gone, and in its place was something far more dangerous, the beginning of the truth. The moment did not unfold cleanly. It fractured, splintering across time as the sharp scent of smoke thickened in the air, dragging Julian Mercer backward before he could anchor himself in the present. The world in front of him blurred, Soren's weakened form dissolving into something younger, smaller, standing alone in a corridor filled with heat and flickering light. The same suffocating air pressing in from all sides. 17. The memory hit not as a sequence, but as impact, disjointed and overwhelming. The sound of something collapsing, the crackle of fire climbing higher, faster than it should have. And through it all, a figure moving toward him instead of away. Small, unsteady, but determined. Soren, not silent in the way Julian had known him later, but quiet in a way that felt the same. His presence steady even as everything else broke apart. Julian staggered slightly in the present, his hand bracing against the restraint as the memory forced itself forward, clearer now, sharper, the way Soren had reached him first, not hesitating, not pulling back even when the heat surged, fingers, gripping his arm with a strength that did not match his size, pulling, guiding, staying. The scent, faint but unmistakable, white camellia, soft, grounding, cutting through the smoke in a way nothing else could. Stay with me. A voice, not loud, but firm, steady in a way that did not allow him to drift. Julian's breath caught sharply as the pieces aligned, the scent, the presence, the memory he had never been able to fully grasp until now. It had never been Elliot, not once. The realization hit harder than the fire ever had. The scene shifted again, pulling him forward through time, out of the flames and into something quieter, colder, a hospital room. The aftermath, pain dulled, memory fractured, everything unclear, and there, at the edge of it, the same presence, faint, distant, but real. Soren, sitting beside him, silent, unmoving, as if afraid that even the smallest sound would break something. Julian saw it now, what he had not understood then, the way Soren had stayed, not for recognition, not for gratitude, but because leaving had never been an option. And then another shift, sharper, harsher. Elliot, stepping into that space, filling it, speaking when Soren could not, answering questions that were never directed at him, shaping something fragile into something else entirely. You don't remember? A voice, smooth, careful, guiding. Julian's vision blurred again, the memory tightening, compressing into something suffocating. He had accepted it, not because it was true, but because it had been easier, because it had been given to him in a moment where everything else was uncertain, and Soren had never corrected it, never fought for it, never claimed what had always been his. The present slammed back into place with a force that made Julian stagger, the heat of the fire no longer memory but reality again, the air thick, the light unstable. His grip tightened instinctively. As he tore at the restraint, the material giving way under the force he had not held back before. Soren. The name left him rough, unsteady, stripped of everything it had carried before. This time, it was not distant, not detached. It was real. Soren's head shifted slightly at the sound, barely perceptible, his body too weak to respond fully, but enough to confirm. Julian's chest tightened sharply, something breaking open in a way that did not close again. It was you, he said, the words low, almost lost beneath the sound of the fire. But undeniable. Everything aligned now. Every moment he had dismissed, every instinct he had ignored, every feeling he had forced down because it did not fit the narrative he had been given. The way Soren's presence had always felt familiar, grounding in a way he could not explain, the way his scent had calmed him without reason, the way something in him had always responded, even when his mind had refused to. It had never been confusion. It had been recognition. Julian. Elliot's voice cut through again from behind him, sharper now, no longer controlled, no longer smooth. Julian did not turn. For the first time, he did not respond to it at all, because it no longer held any weight. The truth had already taken its place. The final restraint gave way under his grip, falling loose as he pulled Soren forward, supporting his weight without hesitation, without calculation. The difference was immediate, the faint, familiar scent. Surfacing again despite everything, softer now, weaker, but still there, still the same. Julian's breath caught again, not from the smoke this time, but from something far worse. Realization, guilt, the full weight of everything he had done, everything he had chosen, crashing down without resistance. He had pushed him away, again and again. He had doubted him, blamed him, hurt him, and when it mattered most, when it should have been clear, he had chosen someone else, twice. "I'm here," Julian said, his voice rough, unsteady in a way it had never been before, not a command, not a statement, but something closer to a promise he had no right to make. Soren did not respond, not in words, not in movement, but his breathing shifted slightly, uneven but present. Julian tightened his hold instinctively, as if that alone could keep everything from slipping further. Behind them, the fire continued to spread, faster now, the structure around them beginning to give way. The present demanded action, but Julian did not move immediately, because for the first time, standing there with the truth fully in front of him, there was something he could not escape, something he could not outrun, not the fire, not the danger, but himself, because this time, there was no one left to blame, no version of events to hide behind, no misunderstanding to justify what had happened. There was only the truth, and it came too late. The collapse did not wait for resolution. It came with force, the structure around them groaning under the strain as heat intensified and the air thickened beyond breath. Julian Mercer did not hesitate this time. The delay already carved into him too deeply to repeat, his arm tightening around Soren Blythe as he forced a path forward through the unstable space, each step deliberate, driven by something far beyond instinct now. "Stay with me," he said again, the words rough, urgent, no longer a command but a plea, his voice breaking in a way it never had before. Soren did not respond, his body too weak, too drained, his weight uneven against Julian's hold. But his breathing, faint and fragile, remained. It was enough. It had to be enough. The exit felt impossibly far, the distance stretching under pressure, but Julian did not slow, did not allow the thought of failure to surface again. Not this time. When they finally broke through into open air, the shift was immediate, the heat falling away just enough to make space for something else, something colder, sharper, reality crashing back in. Voices, movement, the distant sound of sirens cutting through the chaos. Julian lowered Soren carefully, his hands unsteady now, not from exhaustion, but from something far worse, fear. "Get help," he said sharply, though he did not look away, his focus locked entirely on Soren, on the rise and fall of his chest. Uneven, too light. Someone moved. He didn't register who. It didn't matter. "Soren," he said again, quieter this time. The name no longer unfamiliar, no longer distant, but something fragile, something he was terrified of losing. There was no answer, only breath, and then hands were pulling him back, voices directing, separating. But Julian resisted for half a second before letting go, because this time, letting go did not mean walking away. Not anymore. Across the scene, Elliot Crane was no longer composed, the calm precision gone, replaced with something fractured, something desperate. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he said, his voice tight, controlled only on the surface, as if the narrative he had built was slipping beyond his reach. The people around him did not respond, did not engage, their attention already shifting away, because whatever control he had once held no longer applied here, not in this space, not after this. Consequences did not arrive loudly, but they arrived completely. By the time Elliot realized it, there was no room left to maneuver, no version of events he could reshape into something else. And for the first time, he was no longer the one directing what came next. The days that followed did not pass cleanly. They blurred, overlapping in fragments that Julian could not fully separate, each moment threaded with the same constant weight that refused to lift. The hospital became the only place that mattered, its quiet too controlled, too sterile to match what was happening inside him. Soren remained under observation, his condition unstable, the strain of everything he had endured compounding with what had already been there long before. Julian was not allowed near him, not at first, and when he tried, the answer did not change. "He doesn't want to see you," Daniel Reeves said, his tone steady, not unkind, but firm in a way that left no space for negotiation. Julian's jaw tightened, the response immediate, instinctive. "He doesn't get to decide that right now," he said, but even as the words left him, they sounded wrong. Daniel's gaze did not shift. "That's exactly what he gets to decide. he replied, quieter now, but no less certain. The silence that followed stretched, heavier than before. Julian did not argue again, not because he agreed, but because for the first time, he understood that forcing his way in would not fix anything. It would only repeat what had already been done. Inside the room, Soren lay still, the steady rhythm of monitored breath the only indication that he remained anchored to the present. Daniel adjusted the position of the blanket slightly, his movements careful, precise, the kind that came from understanding rather than obligation. "You made it this far," he said quietly, not expecting a response. "Not needing one. So you keep going." Soren's fingers shifted faintly against the fabric, the movement small, but deliberate. It was enough. Outside, Julian remained where he had been told to stay, the distance between him and the door more significant than any barrier he had faced before. The weight of realization did not fade with time. It deepened, settling into something permanent, something that did not allow escape. When his grandfather arrived, the presence was quieter than before, but no less heavy. "You remember now," the old man said. Not a question. Julian didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. The answer was already clear. "Why didn't you tell me?" Julian asked finally, his voice lower now, stripped of the control he once held so tightly. "Any of it." The OD man studied him for a moment, then exhaled quietly, something close to regret settling into his expression. "I did," he said, simply. Julian's gaze sharpened, confusion cutting through the exhaustion. "No, you didn't," he replied, but the certainty was already weaker than before. "Not in the way you were willing to hear," the old man corrected, his tone calm, but unyielding. "And he tried too." The words landed heavier than anything else. More than once, Julian stilled. The silence that followed was different now, not empty, but filled with something he could not push away. "You didn't listen," the old man continued, not harsh, not accusatory, just stating what had already happened. "And each time you didn't, you made it harder for him to try again." Julian's breath caught slightly, the memory surfacing now, not of what he had forgotten, but of what he had dismissed, the moments he had cut off, the words he had refused to hear. "He asked me not to say anything," the old man added, quieter now. "He thought if you stayed by his side, you would remember on your own." A pause, just long enough to let the next words settle fully. He believed that was enough. Julian closed his eyes briefly, the weight of it pressing down in a way that left no space to stand against it. "It wasn't," he said, the words barely audible. The old man did not respond. He didn't need to. They both knew that already. Inside the room, Soren's condition remained fragile, monitored closely, each small change noted, each shift significant. Daniel remained at his side, steady, present, offering nothing more than what was needed, and nothing less. When Soren finally opened his eyes, the movement was slow, unfocused at first before settling, his gaze drifting toward the window rather than the door. Daniel followed the motion briefly, then returned his attention. "You're safe," he said quietly. Soren blinked once, the words registering slowly, his breathing still uneven, but present. Daniel didn't mention Julian. He didn't need to. Soren already knew. And outside, Julian remained where he was, the distance unchanged, the understanding now complete, and for the first time, there was no part of him that believed he had the right to close it. The line between survival and loss had already been crossed long before anyone said it out loud. It showed in the urgency of movement, in the way voices lowered instead of rising, in the quiet efficiency of hands that no longer hesitated because there was no time left for doubt. Soren Blythe was moved quickly, carefully, the world around him reduced to fragments of light and sound that no longer connected, his body too weak to hold on to anything but the faint, fragile rhythm that still remained. Somewhere beyond that fading awareness, there was pressure, voices, a presence steady and familiar. "Stay with me," Daniel Reeves said, his voice controlled but softer than it had ever been. Not a command, not an instruction, but something closer to a promise he could not guarantee. The moment did not stretch, it collapsed inward, decisive, irreversible. When it was over, the silence that followed was not empty. It was final, for a brief moment, just a fraction of time that felt Separate from everything else, Soren's eyes opened. The world did not come into focus, not fully, but there was enough. Enough to register the small weight placed beside him. Enough to recognize what it was. His hand moved, slow, unsteady, fingertips brushing lightly against something impossibly small, impossibly warm. The contact was brief, but deliberate. A breath, uneven but present, a faint shift that might have been a smile, or something close to it, something that did not need to be seen, clearly to be understood, and then it was gone. Daniel did not move immediately, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the bed, as if grounding himself in something that no longer remained. His expression did not break, not outwardly, but the stillness in it carried more weight than any visible reaction. He exhaled slowly, once, then reached forward, adjusting what needed to be adjusted, completing what had to be done, because there were still things that required his hands even when there was nothing left to save. When Julian Mercer arrived, it was already too late. The hallway was too quiet, the air too still, the kind of silence that did not leave room for hope. He knew before anyone spoke, before anyone stopped him, before the door even came into view. His steps slowed anyway, not by choice, but because something in him resisted the finality waiting on the other side. When he reached the door, he did not open it immediately. His hand rested there, unmoving, as if that single barrier still held the possibility of something different. It didn't. When the door opened, nothing changed. Soren lay still, the space around him untouched, unchanged, as if time had simply stopped rather than ended. Julian did not step forward right away. For a moment, he stood there, the distance between them stretching into something immeasurable, something that could no longer be crossed in any meaningful way. Soren. The name left him quietly, without force, without expectation, and there was no answer. There would never be one again. The realization did not come all at once. It settled slowly, heavily, leaving no part of him untouched. He took a step forward, then another, the movement unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with balance. When he reached the bed, his hand lifted, stopping just short before finally resting against the stillness he had once taken for granted. It was colder than he remembered. "I'm sorry," he said, the words breaking in a way he could not control, not loud, not desperate, but raw in a way that stripped everything else away. There was nothing left to hold on to, no response to wait for, no forgiveness to earn, only the truth and the weight of it. Outside, life continued in the same quiet, indifferent rhythm it always had. But for Julian, everything had already shifted beyond repair. The days that followed did not move forward so much as they settled into something permanent, something that did not change no matter how much time passed. He returned to the house with the child in his arms, the space larger than it had ever felt before, every corner holding something that no longer existed except in memory. The scent lingered faintly, white camellia, softer now, almost gone, but still there, woven into the air in a way that could not be removed. It followed him from room to room, not strong enough to hold on to, but impossible to ignore. He stopped in front of a drawer he had never opened before, not because it had been hidden, but because he had never thought to look. His hand hesitated for a moment before pulling it open. Inside, there was nothing elaborate, nothing arranged for effect, just a single envelope, placed carefully, deliberately, as if it had been waiting. Julian's fingers tightened slightly as he picked it up, the paper lighter than it should have been. When he opened it, the words did not rush at him. They settled slowly, each one carrying more weight than the last. Maybe we should have never tried to hold on to something that had already ended once. Before, I thought if we stayed close, you would remember, that it would be enough. I was wrong. What happened after that was my choice, not yours. So if you remember now, don't stay there. Don't let it follow you the way it followed me. Take care of him. That's all I wanted in the end. I loved you once, the way I did back then, but I don't think I have the strength to keep loving you the same way again, if there is another life. I hope we don't meet like this." The letter ended there, without signature, without anything more. It didn't need it. Julian did not move for a long time. The paper still in his hands, the silence around him heavier than anything he had faced before. The child shifted slightly against him, a small, fragile presence that carried something familiar, something he could not escape even if he tried. Julian's grip tightened, not on the letter, but on what remained.